The first hint of dawn was a pale, silvery light that crept through the small opening in the wall of their home, a gentle intruder in the world of shadows. It fell across the sleeping form of Xochitl, illuminating the curve of her cheek, and the dark strands of hair fanned across her woven palm fiber mat. A moment later, the familiar rhythmic sound of grinding began, a soft, persistent crunching that was the true herald of morning in their small home on the edge of Tlatelolco. Xochitl's eyes fluttered open. The scent of moist, raw maize filled the single room, a smell as constant and comforting as her mother's presence. Her strong, capable hands moved with a practiced rocking motion, transforming the hard-boiled corn kernels into a fine, pale dough. Each movement was economical, born of a lifetime of repetition, the soft, shushing sound a lullaby and a call to duty all at once. A familiar cocktail of emotions stirred within Xochitl's chest, a flutter of excitement tangled with a knot of nervousness. It was market day. The greatest market in the world lay waiting, a sprawling, vibrant beast of commerce and color just a journey away. Her small, calloused hands, still soft with sleep, clenched with anticipation. Rising quietly, she padded across the hard-packed earthen floor to join her mother. Without a word, she took her place, accepting a portion of the damp, coarse dough to begin shaping into perfect round tortillas. Her small fingers pressed and patted, her movements less assured than her mother's, but filled with an earnest determination. Each perfectly formed circle was a small promise, a humble offering to the bustling world of the plaza. And the world beyond their threshold began to awaken, echoing the hopeful, anxious rhythm of her own heart. The sun had fully claimed the sky by the time they stepped from the cool dimness of their home into the warming world. Xochitl carried a tightly woven basket on her back, its weight a comforting pressure. Filled with the morning's labor stack upon stack of fresh, pliable tortillas wrapped in a clean cloth. Her mother carried the heavier pot of beans, its earthy, simmered scent, a humble promise amidst the grander aromas beginning to drift on the air. They joined the growing stream of people flowing from the maze of small, adobe homes that clustered at the city's edge. Sandaled feet whispered against the packed earth causeway, a soft, shuffling rhythm that was the city's true pulse. Xochitl walked close to her mother's side, her eyes wide, drinking in the sight of so many people, farmers with baskets of produce, artisans carrying carefully bundled goods, and traders whose faces were etched with the dust of faraway roads. And the smoke from their own hearth slowly thickened, layered with the distant gathering hum of a waking giant. Was a sound that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of her feet, a low thrum of thousands of voices, a percussive undercurrent of activity still too far away to distinguish. Then came the first tantalizing threads of scent that made her stomach clench with a sudden sharp hunger. The sharp, clean smell of wood smoke, the earthy sweetness of roasting squash, and the unmistakable, mouth-watering fragrance of fresh tortillas from 1,000 different comals. A scent so like her own yet infinitely multiplied. The causeway widened and the stream of people deepened, the current pulling them forward with an irresistible force. Canoes glided silently along the canals that flanked the road, piled high with goods, bright feathers, woven mats, clay vessels all heading in the same direction. Xochitl felt a thrill course through her, a nervous energy that made her fingers tighten on the strap of her basket. The great marketplace was no longer a distant idea. It was a presence, a beast awakening just beyond the next bend. Its breath a mixture of smoke and spice, its voice a rising, exhilarating roar. The causeway curved, and then it was there. Not as a distant hum or a collection of smells, but as a living, breathing entity that filled the world. Xochitl's breath caught in her throat, her steps faltering for a moment as the full, staggering spectacle of the Tlatelolco market unveiled itself. It was a sight that no amount of previous visits could ever truly prepare her for, a sensory onslaught that was both magnificent and terrifying. A vast, shimmering sea of color stretched out before her, a sprawling mosaic of humanity and commerce that seemed to swallow the horizon. Countless awnings of every hue, vibrant reds from cochineal dye, deep indigos, sun-faded yellows, and rich greens billowed gently in the morning breeze like the petals of some colossal, impossible flower. They formed a patchwork canopy over a labyrinth of stalls, so dense and numerous that the ground itself was nearly invisible. The air, which had been merely thick with promise on the causeway, was now a solid wall of sound and scent. It was a roaring cacophony of 10,000 conversations, the calls of vendors, the bleating of penned animals, the rhythmic pounding of artisans at work, all blending into a single pulsing heartbeat. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. The market was a city within a city, a teeming, chaotic universe governed by its own frantic laws. From her vantage point, the people were not individuals, but a single, shifting mass, a multicolored current flowing through the narrow channels between the stalls. The energy that radiated from the plaza was a physical force, a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the heat of concentrated life, of ambition, of desperation, and of joy, all swirling together in a dizzying vortex. Xochitl felt incredibly small, a single drop of water in a roaring river. The familiar nervousness that had been a companion since dawn now sharpened into a keen edge of awe, bordering on fear. The basket on her back, which had felt so substantial and important at home, now seemed a pitifully humble offering to this gargantuan entity. And stories converged, and for a moment, standing on its threshold, she was utterly overwhelmed by its magnificent, terrifying power. Cecile's small hand found her mother's, her fingers locking tightly around the familiar work-roughened skin. The contact was an anchor in the swirling chaos, a tether to the world she knew. Her mother's grip was firm and reassuring, silent command to stay close as they began their descent into the market's vibrant heart. Here, the edge of the great plaza was a zone of frantic preparation, a backstage to the main spectacle. They passed a pair of market guards, their imposing figures standing with a watchful stillness that contrasted sharply with the fluid motion around them. Each held a tall, fearsome Makua Weedle, the wooden war club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades glinting in the early sun. Their faces were impassive, their eyes scanning the crowds with a practiced detachment, a reminder of the strict order that underpinned the market's apparent bedlam. Xochitl instinctively pressed closer to her mother's side, the sight of the weapons sending a fresh shiver through her small frame. Just beyond the guards, the canals were choked with activity. Early merchants, their muscles straining, were unloading their precious cargoes directly from the boats. Xochitl watched, mesmerized, as one man hefted a massive basket overflowing with glossy green avocados. Their skins still damp from their journey across the lake. Another carefully handed up a crate from which protruded the brilliant iridescent blue tail feathers of a cotinga bird, each one a sliver of captured sky. The air near the water was thick with the damp, earthy smell of the lake and the pungent scent of fish from a nearby delivery. Her mother guided them skillfully through this organized tumult, her steps sure and purposeful. They weaved between piles of unopened sacks and stacks of pottery, avoiding the busy porters who rushed past with burdens balanced on their backs. The noise was different here, less of the market's roar and more the grunts of labor. The splash of oars, the thud of goods being set down, and the brisk bargaining chatter of the wholesalers. It was the sound of the market being built anew each day, and Xochitl, with her hands securely in her mother's, felt a part of its foundational pulse. No longer just an overwhelmed spectator, but a participant in its daily creation. And into a slightly quieter corner of the sprawling market, a niche they had claimed as their own on countless previous days. The space was modest, a narrow strip of packed earth between a vendor selling dried chilies and another offering bundles of fragrant herbs. It was a humble stage for their humble goods, a tiny island in the vast sea of commerce. She unrolled the 2 woven palm fiber mats her mother handed her, laying them side by side on the ground, smoothing their surfaces with a flat palm until they formed a clean, inviting display area. The rough texture was familiar beneath her fingers, a tactile connection to home and routine. The warm, pliable tortillas, still faintly steaming from the morning's work, were arranged in neat, tempting stacks. She placed them with a reverent care, ensuring each golden brown circle was visible, each stack a perfect edible tower. She lifted the lid, and a rich, earthy aroma wafted up, a simple, hearty scent that was their own small contribution to the market's complex olfactory symphony. Xochitl arranged a few clean, shallow clay bowls beside the pot, ready to serve a portion to a hungry customer. The final touch was a small, intricately woven basket placed strategically at the front of the mats, its emptiness a hopeful promise for the cacao beans and other small trade items they prayed the day would bring. As she finished the arrangement, Xochitl sat back on her heels and looked around. To their left, a merchant was unfurling. A magnificent cotton mantle dyed a brilliant, impossible blue. To their right, a goldsmith was arranging delicate necklaces that caught the sun and threw it back in dazzling sparks. Yet in the precise order of their mats, the warmth of their food, and the shared silent understanding between mother and daughter, their stall possessed its own quiet dignity. It was a testament to perseverance, a small, steady flame of sustenance burning brightly amidst the roaring fire of empire. The market's energy had settled into its full, throbbing rhythm, a constant flow of bodies and voices swirling around their small stall. Xochitl watched the passing crowds, her eyes tracing the sandaled feet that moved past their mats without pausing, her hope beginning to fray at the edges like a worn cloth. Then, an elderly man with a face deeply carved by sun and years slowed his pace. His gaze, sharp and assessing, fell upon their neat stacks of tortillas. He moved with a deliberate slowness, each step measured, until he stood before them. They emerged holding a precious handful of cacao beans, their dark, wrinkled surfaces gleaming like polished stones in the sunlight. Her mother nodded, her expression serene and accepting, and began to count out a stack of tortillas in return, her movements economical and respectful. The transaction was conducted in a wordless understanding, an ancient dance of trade that required no speech. Then the beans were passed to Xochitl. Her heart beat a little faster as her small cupped hands received them. They were surprisingly heavy for their size, each bean a small, hard treasure, their faint, bitter chocolate sent a promise of wealth and flavor. This was at the first exchange, the moment their long morning of labor transformed into something tangible. She knelt on the mat, creating a clear space before her, and began the careful, solemn ritual of counting. One bean, then another, her fingertip pushing each one into a new growing pile. Her entire world narrowed to this task, the market's roar fading to a distant hum. Each bean was a victory, a validation. She counted slowly, meticulously, ensuring the number was fair and true, her brow furrowed in concentration. This small handful of bitter seeds was more than payment. It was the first thread in the tapestry of their day's earnings, a beginning woven from trust and tortillas. A new scent began to weave its way through the familiar aromas of their stall. A sharp, acrid thread that cut through the earthy warmth of beans and maize. It was the smell of fire and earth meeting the skin of chilies, a pungent, almost aggressive fragrance that announced itself long before its source was visible. Xochitl's eyes, still focused on the small pile of cacao beans from their first customer, began to sting. A reflexive tear welled in the corner of each eye, not from sadness but from the air itself turning into a mild, invisible assault. She blinked, wiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist, and looked toward the neighboring stall. There, an older woman with a practiced, unhurried grace was tending to a wide clay comal set over a bed of glowing embers. Dozens of chili-splump dark green poblanos and smaller, fiercer serranos sizzled and blistered on the hot surface. The woman used a pair of worn wooden tongs, turning each pepper with a deft flick of her wrist. As the skins blackened and split, they released a complex, smoky perfume that was both painful and utterly captivating. Xochitl watched, transfixed. The vendor's movements were a form of silent poetry, a dance of heat and patience. There was no wasted motion. Each turn was precise, ensuring an even char, each shift of the peppers on the comal calculated to make the most of the fire's kiss. The chilies writhed and popped on the heat, their vibrant green flesh transforming into something deeper, richer, their essence vaporizing into the air to make eyes water and mouths water in equal measure. This was alchemy, the transformation of simple fruit into the very soul of flavor, and Xochitl understood in that moment that this too was a kind of magic as potent and essential as any sold by the healers or feather workers. It was the magic of fire and food, a daily sacrifice that gave the market its unforgettable breath-stealing heart. The sharp, smoky scent of roasting chilies began to fade as a subtle shift in the crowd. Flow drew Xochitl's attention to the stall directly opposite their own. Where the air had been pungent and eye-watering, it now carried the clean, earthy smell of damp clay and wood ash. A potter, his arms dusted with a fine gray powder up to his elbows, was carefully arranging his wares on a low platform of woven reeds. But it was not the simple bowls and jars that captured Tlatelolco's gaze. It was the breathtaking artistry adorning them. A stack of bowls, each one nested within another, formed a perfect, ascending spiral of craftsmanship. Their surfaces were not the plain, utilitarian brown of her family's own vessels. These were canvases. Intricate designs had been etched into the clay before firing, each line precise and confident, telling stories in a language of symbols. There were swirling patterns that mimicked the flow of water, stepped frets that echoed the shapes of temples, stylized flowers with petals that seemed to unfold before her eyes. The colors were rich and deep, a bold, iron-red pigment and a stark, velvety black that stood in stark contrast to the warm terracotta of the clay. The potter noticed her rapt attention, his stern expression softening into one of quiet pride. He picked up one of the finest bowls, holding it gently in his broad, capable hands, turning it so the sunlight caught the grooves of the design. His fingers traced the symbols with a possessiveness that spoke of deep connection. He pointed first to a series of inverted triangles that cascaded down the side of the bowl like falling tears, then to a pattern of circles with dots at their centers that clustered like ripe seeds. With a few economical gestures, he made their meanings clear. The falling triangles were rain, the life-giving tears of the sky god Tlatelolco, essential for the maize to sprout and thrive. The seeded circles were fertility, the promise of abundance, of full stomachs and healthy children. This was not merely a container for food or drink. It was a prayer, a hope molded from earth and fire, a sacred contract with the gods etched in clay for all to see and understand. Xochitl understood. She was not just looking at a bowl. She was witnessing a piece of the world's soul, shaped by human hands, and offered up with silent, profound pride. A ripple of focused intensity moved through the crowd, a subtle shift in the market's chaotic energy that drew all eyes toward a new arrival. The sharp, earthy scents of food and clay were suddenly cut by a palpable air of solemnity. There, under a simple awning of undyed cotton, stood a man whose face was a mask of grim purpose, his features as hard and unyielding as the goods he displayed. He was the obsidian merchant, and his stall was a gallery of gleaming darkness. Upon a length of deep blue cloth, spread with the reverence of an altar cloth, lay his wares. They were not items of sustenance or adornment, but instruments of precision and power, razor-sharp blades, napped to a translucency. So fine the sun caught their edges in shivering lines of light, were arranged in rows like the teeth of some primordial beast. Among them lay the heavier, more ominous forms of sacrificial knives, their handles wrapped in rough cord for a secure grip, their curved points promising a swift and certain passage to the gods. Each piece was a masterpiece of controlled fracture, born from the heart of volcanic glass. And each seemed to drink the sunlight rather than reflect it, holding the light within its glossy black depths. A crowd had already begun to gather, forming a respectful semicircle before the stall. It was a different kind of audience than those haggling over cloth or chocolate. Here were warriors, their proud, scarred faces intent as they assessed the lethal elegance of a blade's balance, imagining its weight in their hands. Among them stood priests, their heads shaved and their expressions inscrutable, their eyes not on the weapon's potential for war, but for sacrament, evaluating the tool for its purity and its ability to perform the most sacred of duties. The merchant moved among his goods with a priest's solemnity, occasionally lifting a piece to demonstrate its perfection, the sun glinting off the wicked edge in a silent, deadly promise. The air around his stall was thick with a silent, heavy reverence, a stark reminder that amidst the market's vibrant life, the instruments of death and devotion were also traded, their value measured, not in cacao beans but in blood and faith. A flash of impossible color, a shimmer of living light, snagged Zexus's attention and pulled her gaze away from the somber obsidian merchant. It was as if a piece of the rainforest itself had been captured and brought to the heart of the market. The stall was an explosion of iridescence, a cascade of color so vivid it seemed to vibrate against the more muted tones of woven cloth and fired clay. Xochitl felt her breath catch, her feet moving of their own accord, drawing her closer to this pocket of captured sky and jungle. The stall was a temple dedicated to plumage. It overflowed with feathers of every conceivable hue and texture, each more breathtaking than the last. Long, extravagant quetzal feathers, the color of emeralds and new leaves, cascaded from baskets like waterfalls of living jade, their ends curling delicately as if still catching a high mountain breeze. Among them lay the bold, defiant scarlet of macaw plumes, a red so intense and saturated it seemed to burn, each feather a flame frozen in time. But it was the smaller treasures that truly mesmerized her. Dozens of tiny, iridescent hummingbird skins, carefully preserved, were pinned to a backing of dark fabric. They were jewels of nature, their throats flashing fiery orange, deep violet or electric blue, depending on how the light touched them. A kaleidoscope contained within a space no larger than her palm. The air around the stall held a faint, dry, dusty scent, the smell of preserved beauty, of distant forests and high, cloud-wreathed peaks brought down to the bustling plaza. Xochitl stood transfixed, her earlier awe at the obsidian blades completely forgotten, lost in this silent, stunning symphony of color and light. The artist herself seemed to emerge from the very tapestry of feathers she had created. An older woman whose hands moved with the same delicate precision as the hummingbirds whose skins she treasured. Her fingers, though lined with age, were steady and sure as she beckoned Xochitl closer. On a low work table before her lay a half-finished shield, its wooden frame a stark contrast to the vibrant life taking shape upon its surface. With a small bone tool, she dipped into a pot of sticky, translucent paste made from orchid bulbs, applying a minute amount to the back of a single, perfect Quetzal feather. Then began the magic. With infinite patience, she placed the feather onto the shield's outline design, its emerald length aligning perfectly with the curve of a powerful wing. One by one, she selected feathers, the fiery red of a macaw for the breast, the soft, downy gray of a hawk for the shadowed areas, the brilliant gold of an oriole for the glint in the eye. Each placement was a decision, a brushstroke in a painting made of light and air. Xochitl watched, utterly captivated, as the abstract shapes of glued-down underfeathers began to resolve into a stunning, unmistakable image. An eagle in flight, its wings swept back in powerful descent, its talons extended, its fierce eyes seeming to hold a spark of the very sun it flew toward. The feathers overlapped like scales, creating a texture so real Xochitl half expected the great bird to shake its glorious head and take flight from the shield. It was more than craft, it was conjuring. The woman was not merely gluing feathers, she was piecing together a soul, weaving power and beauty into an object that would carry the spirit of the eagle into battle or ceremony. In the focused stillness of the artist's hands, Xochitl saw a devotion as deep as any priest's. A silent prayer offered not with words, but with the captured beauty of the sky. A new sound wove through the market's cacophony, a rhythmic, melodic call that cut above the general din with the practiced ease of a bird of prey soaring above the treetops. It was a vendor's chant, but unlike any other a deep, resonant baritone that promised not just goods, but pure, unadulterated pleasure. The voice belonged to a man standing proudly behind a large burnished clay vat, from which rose a scent so rich and complex it seemed to stop time itself. It was the chocolate seller, and his stall was an oasis of decadence in the bustling plaza. His chant was a litany of virtues, a poetic recitation of the drink's divine qualities. He sang of the frothy texture, achieved by pouring the precious liquid from one gourd to another at a great height, aeration that promised a lightness to match the heavens. He extolled the complex spices, the warming kiss of vanilla, the subtle heat of chili, the mysterious floral note of magnolia blossom that transformed the bitter cacao into a symphony of flavor. His words painted pictures of strength and vitality, of clarity of mind and warmth of spirit, all contained within the deep brown depths of his brew. The aroma was irresistible, a thick, velvety cloud that wrapped around Xochitl and pulled her toward the stall. It was the smell of roasted earth and exotic flowers, of smoke and honey, and something profoundly, indescribably luxurious. She watched, mesmerized, as a group of wealthy nobles, their cotton mantles finely embroidered and their hair dressed with gleaming ornaments, paused before the vendor. They exchanged knowing smiles, the chant clearly a familiar and anticipated pleasure. With a theatrical flourish, the seller dipped a polished gourd into the vat, filling it with the steaming dark liquid. He then poured it into an empty gourd held at his waist, raising it high above his head in a long, graceful arc. The stream of chocolate catching the light before falling perfectly into the lower vessel. He repeated this several times until a thick, foamy head crowned the drink. One of the nobles handed over a small pouch of cacao beans without a moment's hesitation, receiving the filled gourd with a look of pure anticipation. Xochitl savored the rich aroma that washed over her, a scent that spoke of a world of privilege and pleasure. Far removed from her own simple stall of tortillas and beans, a fleeting, beautiful dream captured in a gourd and sold for a song. Shift in the light and a rustle of unfolding fabric drew Xochitl's gaze from the chocolate seller's opulent performance to a quieter, yet no less dazzling spectacle nearby. Under a wide awning of plain cotton, a group of women from distant highland regions were preparing their own form of magic. Their hands, dark and nimble, worked with a ceremonial slowness, unfurling lengths of cloth that seemed to hold captured sunsets, deep forests, and twilight skies within their woven threads. These were the textile weavers, and their stall was a library of stories told not in words, but in color and pattern. Xochitl watched, utterly captivated, as one woman shook out a mantle of such brilliant cochineal red it seemed to bleed color into the very air around it. The dye was so deep and rich it appeared liquid, a crimson so potent it spoke of power and nobility. Another unfolded a blanket woven in the intricate geometric patterns of her mountain village, each diamond and zigzag a representation of the terraced fields that climbed the steep slopes of her home, a map of survival etched in brown and ochre wool. But it was the cotton mantles that truly stole Xochitl's breath. One dyed a profound indigo that rivaled the deepest hour of the night, was embroidered with a swirling, complex pattern of stylized waves. In water serpents, the story of the rain god Tlaloc's dominion over the lakes and storms. Another, in a softer, sky-blue hue, depicted the stepped fret of a temple and a hummingbird in flight. A narrative of sacred spaces and messengers to the gods. The women moved with a quiet pride, her eyes holding the knowledge of countless hours at the backstrap loom of hands stained with dyes made from crushed insects, mollusk shells, and rare plants. Each fold revealed a new chapter, each pattern a sacred glyph representing a different deity, a different village, a different understanding of the world. The textiles were more than mere clothing or trade goods. They were identity solidified into fiber, history woven thread by thread, a silent, vibrant testament to the countless hands and hearts that had poured their stories into the loom. Xochitl understood that she was not just looking at cloth. She was witnessing the soul of distant communities unfolded, and offered to the humming heart of Tlatelolco, a silent, stunning conversation between the weavers and the world. The dazzling colors and hypnotic rhythms of the weaver's stall had lulled Xochitl into a dreamlike state, her senses saturated with beauty and story. Drifting slightly from her mother's side, drawn by the press of the crowd and her own wandering curiosity, she followed a narrow, less-traveled aisle that curved away from the main thoroughfare. The vibrant chatter of the market began to dull, replaced by a different, heavier quality of silence. The air grew thick and still, the familiar sense of spice and food giving way to the acrid smell of unwashed bodies and despair. It was then she saw them. A row of figures, motionless as statues, tethered to a long, low post. They were captives, their eyes hollow and fixed on some distant, unseen point, their spirits seemingly shrunken within their frames. But it was the cruel, crude wooden collars locked around their necks that seized Xochitl's breath. Collars were heavy, rough-hewn things, branding each person as property, as something less than human. Some collars were empty, waiting. One man, his face a mask of resigned agony, had a raw, weeping sore where the wood chafed against his skin. A woman beside him, her once fine clothing now torn and dirty, held herself with a brittle dignity that made the indignity of her collar seem all the more monstrous. Xochitl's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was not the beautiful, ordered chaos of the market. This was its dark, hidden underbelly, a place where people were goods, their value measured in muscle and obedience. The silent suffering emanating from the figures was a cold wave that washed over her. Extinguishing the day's earlier warmth and wonder, she stood frozen, her small world cracking open to reveal a terrifying truth she had never been meant to see. A hand, firm and urgent, closed around her upper arm, pulling her backward with a force that broke her paralysis. Her mother's face was above hers, her features drawn tight with a fear and sternness Xochitl had never witnessed before. There were no words of comfort, only a low, sharp hiss that was more terrifying than a shout. Her mother's eyes, wide and intense, held a warning so absolute it felt like a physical barrier. The message was clear, immediate, and chilling. This was a place of danger and sorrow, sight not for her eyes, a knowledge that carried its own weight and peril. She was wrenched away from the grim spectacle, pulled back into the bustling, colorful stream of the main market. The image of the wooden collars and hollow eyes seared into her memory like a brand. The unsettling silence that had gripped Xochitl after the slave market glimpse was slowly washed away by the rising tide of the market's normal clamor. Yet a new sound began to insinuate itself into the fabric of that noise, a sound that did not belong to commerce or conversation. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to originate from the very bones of the city. It was the distant, solemn beating of drums from the temple precinct, a sound that carried a weight and a meaning far beyond the marketplace's vibrant chaos. At first, it was just a background pulse, easily lost in the closer sounds of haggling vendors and clattering goods. But as the minutes passed, the rhythm grew more distinct, each beat a deliberate, resonant boom that traveled across the lake and through the crowded streets to find its way into the heart of Tlatelolco. It was a sound that demanded attention without ever raising its voice, a profound and ancient heartbeat that spoke of things older than trade, more permanent than wealth. The effect on the market was subtle, but unmistakable. Frantic energy seemed to temper the voices to lower just a fraction. A merchant counting cacao beans would pause for a heartbeat, his fingers stilling as the deep thud echoed through the plaza. A woman bargaining for a length of cloth would glance briefly toward the source of the sound, her expression momentarily thoughtful before returning to her negotiation. It was a reminder, a solemn counterpoint to the feverish acquisitions surrounding them. The drums spoke of the gods of sacrifice, of the cosmic order that governed their world, a world where the market's abundance was a gift that required repayment, where life was sustained by death, and where the vibrant, fleeting joys of the plaza existed under the watchful, demanding eyes of the temples. Xochitl felt the sound in her chest, a vibration that resonated with something deep and primal within her. The dazzling feathers, the gleaming gold, the rich chocolate all of it, suddenly seemed smaller, more fragile. The drums were the true voice of the city, a sound that put the market's frantic dance into perspective. It was a call to remember that beyond the awnings and the stalls, on the high pyramids that scraped the sky, another more solemn economy was at work. One that dealt not in cacao beans or cotton mantles, but in faith and blood, ensuring the sun would rise again and the rains would fall upon their fields. The distant drums were the bedrock upon which their world was built, and for a moment the entire market seemed to hold its breath, listening to the solemn, unchanging rhythm of its own soul. The solemn, grounding rhythm of the temple drums faded into the background hum of the market as a new, more immediate scent beckoned Xochitl forward, a dry, aromatic fragrance that spoke of earth, knowledge, and secrets. It was a smell of sun-baked herbs, of dusty roots, and something faintly metallic, like old stones warmed by the sun. The stall from which it emanated was a world apart from the vibrant textiles and gleaming obsidian. It was a place of shadows and whispers, presided over by a curandero, whose face was a roadmap of deep lines, each one seeming to hold a story of its own. His domain was a carefully arranged tableau of nature's hidden powers. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the crossbeam of his simple awning, their leaves curled and brittle, their scents sharp mint, pungent episote, bitter wormwood, mingling into a complex medicinal perfume. On a mat of dark reeds before him lay an array of more mysterious objects. There were animal bones, bleached white by the sun and scoured clean by ants, each one a delicate architecture from a rabbit, a bird, a snake, their shapes hinting at the creatures they once supported. But it was the obsidian mirrors that truly captured the light and the imagination. 3 of them lay nestled on a piece of black cloth, their surfaces not clear glass but pools of captured darkness. volcanic glass polished to a smoky, profound sheen. They did not reflect the world as it was, but seemed to swallow the light, offering glimpses of a deeper, shifting reality within their depths. The curandero's eyes, dark and perceptive, noted Xochitl's hesitant fascination. He did not beckon her with a vendor's chant or a merchant's smile. Instead, he picked up a bundle of rue, holding it out for her to smell its sharp, cleansing odor. With a few deliberate gestures, he pantomimed waving it over a sleeping person, then pointed to the sky, indicating its power to ward off malaria, the bad air of illness. Next, he selected a delicate bird skull, its beak needle-sharp. He pointed to his own ear, then to the skull, and made a gentle blowing motion through it, a silent explanation of how such a bone could be used to blow healing prayers into an afflicted body. Finally, his gnarled fingers hovered over one of the obsidian mirrors. He did not touch it, but instead gestured for Xochitl to look closer. As she leaned in, her own wide, curious eye appeared for a moment in the dark surface, not as a clear reflection, but as a ghostly impression, a fleeting image that seemed to swim in the stone's liquid depths. He then waved a hand over the mirror, his fingers tracing patterns in the air above it, his expression one of intense concentration. He was showing her, without a single word, that this was not for seeing the self, but for scrying, for peering through the veil of the present into the misty realms of fate and spirit. It was an invitation into a world where the elements of earth and animal held power, where healing and seeing were intertwined, and where the most potent medicines were not tasted but believed. The sharp mineral scent of the healer's stall gave way to something far more alluring, a fragrance of sun-warmed metal and fine, dry dust that drew Xochitl like a moth to a flame. It was the smell of wealth itself, ancient and immutable. The stall that materialized before her was not like the others, draped in colorful cloth or piled high with practical goods. It was a shrine to brilliance, a carefully curated display set upon a low dais of polished dark wood that seemed to absorb the noise and chaos of the market around it, creating a pocket of hushed reverence. Upon cloths of deepest indigo, items of breathtaking delicacy were arranged with a precision that bordered on worship. They were all fashioned from the tears of the sun, god-gleaming, buttery gold that caught the light and held it, spinning it into a soft, captive glow. Xochitl's eyes widened, her breath stilling in her chest. There were intricate necklaces composed of hundreds of tiny, perfectly formed beads, so finely wrought they seemed like a cascade of solidified sunlight. There were heavy, ornate ear spools designed to stretch the lobes of noblemen, their surfaces etched with the faces of gods, each detail sharper than a razor. Armbands coiled like sleeping serpents, their scales picked out with minuscule precision. But it was the smaller pieces that truly captivated her. Pendant, no larger than her thumbnail, depicted a butterfly in mid-flight. Its wings so delicately rendered she could see the veins traced in the thinnest filaments of gold. Each one a miracle of the goldsmith's art. Beside it lay a brooch in the form of a coiled serpent, its body a sinuous curve of polished metal, its eyes too tiny, chips of obsidian that glittered with a knowing darkness. These were not mere ornaments. They were power and status given physical form, objects of such sacred beauty and value that they existed in a world entirely separate from her own. They were meant for the necks of high priests, the wrists of princesses, the ears of generals, for those who walked with the gods and commanded the fate of empires. Xochitl stood transfixed, her humble world of tortillas and cacao beans receding into insignificance. She did not dare move closer, understanding instinctively that this beauty was not for her to touch, only to witness a glimpse into a realm of divine privilege, shimmering and untouchable, just an arm's length away. The air itself seemed to thicken, transforming from a mere medium for sound and sent into a rich, tangible broth of aromas, so potent they felt like a meal in themselves. It was a siren's call of sustenance, a fragrant cloud that pulled Xochitl deeper into a narrow, bustling alleyway where the true culinary heart of Tlatelolco beat loudest. This was the domain of the food vendors, a cacophonous, steam-wreathed corridor where hunger was both created and satisfied in the same breath. The first wave to hit was the unmistakable savory scent of roasting turkey, a deep, fatty aroma that spoke of feasts and celebration. It came from a massive clay oven, where several birds, their skins crisped to a perfect golden brown, turned slowly on a spit over glowing mesquite coals. Juices dripped and sizzled on the embers below, sending up tiny clouds of fragrant smoke that wrapped around the crowd. Next came the comforting, earthy smell of simmering maize stew from a dozen different pots, each with its own character. Some were simple and homely, redolent with squash and epazote, while others were complex and spicy. Their surfaces shimmering with a slick of chili oil and bobbing with tender pieces of rabbit or fish. But weaving through it all, a constant and irresistible thread, was the scent of fresh tamales. Women with quick, practiced hands worked at a furious pace, spreading masa onto corn husks with a wooden paddle, adding dollops of spicy beans or shredded meat, then folding the husks into neat packets with a flick of the wrist. These little parcels were then stacked high in immense clay steamers, from which billowed great clouds of moist, fragrant vapor that carried the sweet corn-like essence of the masa and the subtle perfume of the steaming leaves. The air in the alley was hot, heavy, and alive, a symphony of sizzle, bubble, and hiss conducted by the vendors. Cries and the appreciative murmurs of the crowd, all of them moving in a hungry, happy daze through this paradise of smell and promise. The rich, layered symphony of smells was a physical presence in the narrow alley, a fog of deliciousness that clung to skin and clothing alike. Xochitl's stomach, long since emptied of its simple morning meal, gave a low, insistent rumble, a visceral protest against the tantalizing onslaught. It was a deep, hollow sound that seemed to echo the emptiness within her, a primal demand that pulled her focus to a small, bustling stall tucked between two larger steamers. There, a woman with a face glistening with heat and concentration presided over a wide, flat comal made of dark, well-seasoned clay. The stone glowed with a steady, radiating heat, its surface so hot the air above it shimmered and danced. In her hands, she held a ball of pale maize dough, which she slapped onto the hot surface with a soft, practiced thud. Almost immediately the dough began to cook, releasing a warm, toasty scent that was the very essence of corn and comfort. With a quick, fluid motion, she used her fingers to flip the tortilla, the side now facing up already blistered with perfect golden brown spots. A moment later she flipped it again, and then with a final, graceful flick of her wrist, she sent the finished tortilla sailing through the air to land perfectly atop a growing stack beside her. But the true magic came next. With the same economical movement, she took a warm tortilla from the stack and dipped her fingers into a large, shallow bowl of mashed avocado. The fruit was perfectly ripe, its flesh a pale, buttery green, mixed with just a few flecks of tomato and a hint of sharp onion. She spread a generous portion onto the center of the tortilla, the creamy richness, a stark, luxurious contrast to the simple, toasted grain. She folded it deftly and handed it to a waiting customer, who accepted it with a look of pure, uncomplicated bliss, before melting back into the crowd. Xochitl watched, mesmerized, her mouth flooding with saliva. The simple, elegant transformation of humble ingredients into something so immediately satisfying felt like a different kind of alchemy than the goldsmith's or the featherworker Esan, everyday magic of hunger sated. A quiet, delicious prayer of gratitude offered not to the gods but to the stomach. The rich, fatty aromas of the food alley began to recede, replaced by a new, cleaner, and more elemental scent that cut through the air with a sharp mineral temps. It was the smell of the sea itself, a briny, an ancient fragrance that felt utterly foreign amidst the landlocked bustle of Tlatelolco. Drawn by this strange new thread in the market's olfactory tapestry, Xochitl followed it to a stall that seemed both simpler and more vital than any she had yet encountered. Under a faded awning, merchants with skin darkened and leathered by coastal suns and constant wind displayed their wares. There were no intricate designs here, no flashes of color or gleam of metal. Their goods were humble, yet possessed a stark, profound importance. Before them lay great, rough-hewn blocks of pure white salt, some as large as bricks, others broken into smaller, manageable chunks. They gleamed with a soft, crystalline light, like captured pieces of the dry season sun or shards of bleached bone. The salt traders themselves moved with a quiet, assured dignity, their hands cracked and dusted with a fine white powder, handling the blocks with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. One of the merchants, noticing Tlatelolco's curious gaze, picked up a smaller chunk. He held it out on his palm, not as an item for sale in that moment, but as a lesson. With his other hand, he pantomimed the actions that gave the salt its immense value. First, he gestured toward the food alley they had just left. Mimicking the act of sprinkling the crystals over a piece of meat, his fingers fluttering down to illustrate how it would draw out the flavors, make them richer, deeper, more alive. Then his mime shifted. He pretended to pack strips of fish or turkey in the white crystals, then made a sweeping gesture indicating the passage of many suns and moons. His meaning was clear. This substance had the magical power to halt the relentless march of decay, to preserve the bounty of a good hunt or a large catch against the hunger of future days. This was not a luxury. It was a necessity. It was the taste of the distant crashing ocean, the essence of preservation, the ghost of flavor that could mean the difference between survival and want. In that simple white block, Xochitl saw not just a trade, it's good, but a fundamental pillar of life hauled from the distant coast and offered here. In the heart of the empire, with the quiet pride of those who commanded the very taste of time, amidst the grand commerce of sustenance and splendor, a pocket of pure, simple joy beckoned from a small, sun-dappled stall, tucked between a cellar of reed baskets and a mender of sandals. Here the air held the clean, earthy scent of unfired clay and the faint, sweet smell of the artist's patience. A kind-eyed man, his fingers stained with reddish dust, sat on a low stool, his entire world contained within the space of his lap and the mat before him. He was the toy maker, and his domain was one of whimsy and innocence. Spread upon a length of plain cotton cloth lay a miniature menagerie, a silent, charming carnival of tiny creatures and objects, each one shaped by his gentle, knowing hands. There were plump, cheerful owls with wide, inquisitive eyes, their feathers suggested by delicate, incised lines. There were coiled serpents, their bodies forming perfect spirals, impatient. Long-eared rabbits caught in a perpetual alert stillness. But the true marvels were the small, hollow-bodied whistles, shaped like birds with open beaks. They were miracles of simplicity, their forms smooth and inviting to a child's touch, promising a single, clear note of pure delight. Xochitl's feet carried her to the edge of his mat, as if pulled by an invisible string. Her earlier hunger, her awe at the golden feathers, all faded into the background. Her entire being focused on a single piece, a small, perfect jaguar cub, no larger than her thumb. It was caught in a playful crouch, its tail curled, its mouth open in a silent snarl that was more charming than fierce. The craftsman had captured its essence with a few elegant curves, and a faint pattern of spots had been painted along its back with a careful brush dipped in black dye. It was a tiny masterpiece of character and joy. Her fingers itched to reach out, to feel the smooth, cool clay beneath her touch, to lift the whistle to her lips and discover its voice. A deep, aching longing bloomed in her chest, a desire so sharp it was almost a physical pain. She imagined the little jaguar sitting on the woven mat by her sleeping place, a companion in the dark, a secret treasure. But as her hand began to rise, the reality of the woven basket at her own stall, with its few precious cacao beans, settled over her like a weight. Each bean was a measure of maize, a portion of beans, a thread in the fabric of their survival. They could not be spared for whimsy, no matter how beautifully crafted. The longing did not vanish, but it was joined by a quiet, resigned understanding. Her hand fell back to her side. She offered the toy maker a small, wistful smile, which he returned with a look of gentle empathy, as if he understood the silent battle waged in her heart. She took one last long look at the playful jaguar, imprinting its image on her memory, then turned away. Carrying the ghost of its unrealized joy with her back into the bustling market, the gentle, wistful quiet that had settled over Xochitl after leaving the toy maker's stall was violently shattered. A raw, jagged sound tore through the market's harmonious cacophony, not the rhythmic chant of a vendor or the friendly haggling of customers, but the unmistakable ugly noise of a dispute boiling over. It was a clash of voices, one sharp with indignant accusation, the other rising in defensive fury. A discordant spike that immediately drew the attention of everyone within earshot. The epicenter of the conflict was a stall not far from where Xochitl stood, a place that moments before had been a quiet exhibit of lapidary artistry. A merchant, his face flushed a dark, angry red beneath his elaborate headdress, was jabbing a finger toward a customer, a well-dressed nobleman whose own composure had cracked, revealing a core of cold, incensed pride. Between them, resting on a square of rich purple cloth, as if to mock the scene with its beauty, lay the object of their fury, a jade necklace. The stones were a deep, oceanic green, carved into smooth, interlocking beads that should have symbolized harmony and value. Now, they seemed to pulse with the energy of the conflict. The nobleman's voice, though lower in pitch, carried a whip-like sharpness. He held one of the beads up to the sunlight, his gestures furious and precise. He was pointing to a nearly invisible flaw, a faint hairline fracture within the heart of the stone that caught the light at a certain angle, a tiny betrayal of its purported perfection. His words, though indistinct from a distance, were clearly accusations of deception, of flawed goods presented as flawless, of a price paid for quality that had not been delivered. The merchant's responses were louder, more desperate, a torrent of defensive explanations. He gestured wildly to his other wares, to his own chest, appealing to his honor and his long-standing reputation. He mimed the act of careful inspection, insisting the flaw was invisible at the time of sale, a natural inclusion, not a crack, and that the value of the piece was in its overall craftsmanship, not its impossible perfection. Spittle flew from his lips as his voice climbed, a man seeing not just a sale unraveling, but his credibility crumbling before the eyes of the entire market. A crowd was already forming, a tight ring of onlookers drawn by the magnetic spectacle of conflict. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and a faint collective tension. Disputes like this were not uncommon, but they were a dangerous spark in the tinder-dry order of the marketplace. The vibrant energy of commerce stilled around them, replaced by a watchful, anxious hush. From the periphery, the distant but swift approach of measured, authoritative footsteps could be heard, cutting through the noise. The market judges, drawn by the escalating chaos, were coming. Their arrival signaled that the matter had moved beyond a simple argument. It was now a case for law, and its resolution would be public, swift, and absolute. The discordant clash of voices faltered and died as three figures emerged from the periphery of the crowd, their presence imposing an immediate, sobering silence. They were the market judges, and their arrival cut through the heated dispute like a blade through smoke. They moved with a unison that spoke of deep authority and unshakable protocol, their stern faces masks of impartial assessment. Dressed in simple but impeccably clean white cotton mantles, devoid of the finery that surrounded them. They were living embodiments of the law that governed the chaotic heart of Tlatelolco. The crowd instinctively parted before them, creating a respectful corridor that led directly to the feuding merchant and nobleman. The judges did not rush. Their steps were measured and deliberate, each footfall a quiet assertion of control. Their eyes, sharp and missing nothing, scanned the scene, the furious nobleman, the defensive merchant, the jade necklace lying between them like an accusation made solid. They took up positions, forming a loose triangle around the disputants, not too close, but near enough to observe every detail. Every flicker of expression, every unconscious gesture of guilt or righteousness. The lead judge, an older man with a face like weathered stone, raised a hand. The gesture was small, but its effect was absolute. Commanded attention without demanding it, a silent order for the facts to be presented. He did not look at the accuser or the accused immediately. Instead, his gaze fell upon the necklace itself. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracing the curve of each bead, the gleam of the polished jade, and the faint hairline flaw that had sparked the conflagration. His two companions remained still, their own eyes cataloging the scene, the posture of the men, the reactions of the closest onlookers, gathering the unspoken truths that hung in the air alongside the spoken ones. Then the hearing began. The nobleman, his anger now tempered by the formality of the proceeding, spoke first. His words were clipped and precise, his gestures economical as he pointed once more to the crack in the bead, his argument one of violated trust and diminished value. The merchant followed, his earlier desperation hardening into a strained formality. He spoke of the natural character of stone, of the necklace's overall excellence, and of the honorable intent of his trade. The judges listened, their faces revealing nothing, absorbing the words, the tones, the subtleties of each claim and counterclaim. The entire market seemed to hold its breath, the usual din reduced to a distant murmur. All energy focused on this small circle where justice was being weighed in the balance. The judge's careful, silent attention was more intimidating than any shouted command. A promise that truth would be found and verdict delivered with the swift, irrevocable force of a falling stone. The tension of the dispute and the judge's sobering presence began to dissipate, slowly absorbed by the market's relentless breathing life. But as the sun climbed to its zenith, a new force asserted its dominance, one as impartial and absolute as the law. The heat arrived. It did not creep in. It descended, a heavy, palpable weight that settled over the sprawling plaza of Tlatelolco. Pressing down on the countless awnings and the sea of people beneath them, the air, once a vibrant mixture of 1,000 scents, grew thick and sluggish, laced with the smell of hot dust, sun-baked stone, and the faint, salty temps of human sweat. The brilliant colors of the stalls seemed to intensify under the harsh, direct light vibrating with a new, almost aggressive energy. The din of the market transformed, its pitch shifting from the sharp cries of commerce to a lower, more persistent buzz, the sound of 10,000 fans stirring the heavy air. Everywhere, handheld fans woven from palm leaves or fashioned from bright feathers moved in a constant, fluttering rhythm, a desperate, collective effort to manufacture a breeze where none existed. Vendors, their faces sheened with perspiration, now called out not just the virtues of their goods, but the relief they offered. A water seller moved through the crowded aisles, his gourd vessels sloshing with cool, fresh water drawn from the deep, clean springs. His voice a welcome chant, promising deliverance from thirst. Others offered slices of pale, watery kima and cool chunks of melon, their pale flesh a visual promise of refreshment. Shade became a precious commodity. The narrow strips of shadow cast by the stalls were crowded with people, taking a moment's respite, their eyes half closed against the glare. Even the guards, usually so still and imposing, shifted their weight subtly, seeking the slight relief of a sliver of shade. Xochitl and her mother took turns using a simple fan of woven reeds. The small puff of air it created a minor blessing against the oppressive warmth. The tortillas on their mat seemed to wilt, and the beans in the pot gave off a steady warm steam that added to the sensation of being in a vast open-air oven. The market, for all its grandeur, was humbled by the sun, its frantic energy subdued into a slow, determined persistence. A collective waiting for the day's fiery peak to pass. The oppressive blanket of midday heat seemed to warp the air itself, making the distant stalls shimmer like visions in a dream. Xochitl, fanning her face with a limp hand, let her gaze drift lazily over the slowed, heat-dazed crowd. It was then that a figure materialized from the wavering haze. A man so utterly out of place that he seemed less a person and more a fragment of a distant land wandered into their world. He moved with a loose-limbed, rolling gait, a walk born of balancing on shifting decks or uneven jungle paths, not the firm-packed earth of the causeways. His clothing was a puzzle of unfamiliarity. Instead of the woven cotton loincloth and mantle common in the plaza, he wore a short, fitted skirt of a strange, fibrous material patterned with bold geometric shapes in a deep, rusty red and a black that swallowed the light. His torso was bare, but 4 intricate markings that coiled over his chest and arms, not painted on but tattooed into his skin with dark, permanent ink. The designs were of swirling waves and sharp-toothed sea creatures, a map of a different world etched onto his flesh. But it was his face that held Xochitl spellbound. Across his broad cheeks and the bridge of his nose were patterns of raised scars, forming ridges that gleamed in the harsh sun. A permanent mask of identity and experience far removed from anything she knew. He stopped at a stall that traded in precious cacao, and as he began to negotiate, the sounds that left his mouth were unlike any language Xochitl had ever heard. It was not the familiar cadence of Nahuatl, nor the dialects of the highland people. His speech was a fluid, guttural flow, full of sharp clicks and rolling consonants that sounded like water rushing over stones and the crackle of a foreign fire. He spoke with his hands as much as his voice, his gestures broad and expressive. painting pictures in the air that the cacao merchant watched with intense, curious focus. From a pouch at his hip, the traveler produced his offering. They were not beans or feathers or crafted goods, but shells. But these were not the common shells from the lake's edge. These were large, spiraled conchs the color of a sunset sky, their interiors gleaming with a mother-of-ove, pearl luminescence. The others were small and delicate, shaped like tiny, perfect fans. Their surfaces patterned with intricate brown dots and lines as if painted by a meticulous miniature artist. They were treasures from a distant ocean, objects that spoke of vast, salty waters and shores she could not even imagine. The merchant's eyes widened, his professional reserve melting into genuine awe. He carefully selected a handful of the finest cacao beans, plump and dark, and placed them in the traveler's scarred palm. The exchange was made, a silent transaction between two worlds, sealed with the currency of the exotic and the essential. The traveler nodded, a sharp, satisfied gesture, tucked the precious beans away, and melted back into the shimmering crowd, leaving behind only the memory of his strange music and the ghost of a far-off sea. The encounter with the distant traveler, a brief and brilliant splash of the exotic, faded into the market's constant, shifting tapestry. The oppressive midday heat began its slow, merciful retreat, the sun's angle softening. And with it, the frantic energy of commerce seemed to mellow into a more contemplative hum. It was then that a new focal point began to coalesce at the edge of the main thoroughfare. Not around a stall of goods, but around a single, ancient figure. An old man, his back curved like a weathered bow, and his face a landscape of deep wrinkles, settled himself upon a low stool in a small patch of shade. He did not call out or chant like the other vendors. His presence alone was the summons. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unfolded a small, faded cloth upon the ground before him, an empty stage for the drama about to unfold. One by one, children, their faces still smudged with the day's adventures, detached from their parents' sides and drifted toward him, drawn by a silent magnetic pull. They settled on the ground in a loose half-circle, their small bodies still, their eyes wide with anticipation. But it was not just the young who were captivated. Adults, too, began to linger at the periphery. Weary porter taking the weight off his feet, a woman with a basket of unsold herbs, a group of off-duty guards, their expressions shifting from the day's concerns to a quiet, receptive readiness. The old man waited until the circle was complete, his milky, knowing eyes scanning the faces before him. He took a slow, deep breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not the loud cry of a merchant, but a low, resonant rumble like stones shifting deep within the earth. It was a voice that carried the weight of countless tellings, a voice that demanded and received absolute silence. He began not with a name or a place, but with a descent, a journey into darkness. He spoke of the 9 levels of Mictlan, the underworld, a cold, silent realm of shadows and whispering winds, a place where the breath of life was a forgotten dream. And then he named the traveler who would dare its depths. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god of wind and wisdom, who set aside his divinity and his glorious plumes to walk the path of the dead. The market's noise seemed to recede, pushed back by the power of the tale, the air growing still and thick with listening. The story had begun, and every soul in the circle was already falling into its dark, sacred depths. The storyteller's body became an instrument of the tale, his voice no longer a mere narration, but a living force that rose and fell with the rhythm of the distant temple drums, which now seemed to beat in time with the story's sacred heart. As he spoke of Quetzalcoatl's perilous journey through the chilling silence of Mictlan, his hands sculpted the air, his fingers tracing the descent through each successive level of darkness. His voice dropped to a haunted whisper describing the whispering winds that carried the regrets of the dead. And the children in the circle leaned forward, their eyes wide, as if they too could feel that ghostly breath on their necks. Then, as the god approached the throne of Mictlantecuhtli, the lord of the dead, the old man's posture shifted. He drew himself up, his spine straightening with a creak of effort, and his face transformed. His features, once soft and wrinkled, seemed to harden into the skeletal, jewel-adorned visage of the death god himself. His eyes narrowed to cold, calculating slits, and his voice became a dry, rasping rattle, the sound of bones scraping together in the deep earth. He mimed the god of death's cruel, mocking smile, his fingers curling like claws, as he described. The impossible tasks set before Quetzalcoatl too: blow a conch shell that had no mouth, to navigate a chamber of razors, to outwit the lords of darkness with nothing but his wits and his grief. But it was the climax of the tale that truly transfixed them all. The storyteller's body, which had been the rigid, cruel form of Tlatelolco, suddenly coiled with a serpent's grace. His arms became the undulating body of the feathered serpent, weaving through the imagined obstacles of the underworld. His voice soared from a rasp to a triumphant wind-like howl as he described Quetzalcoatl's final desperate gamble, not with strength, but with cunning, using a swarm of bees to make the silent shell roar and claiming the precious bones of humanity from their resting place. The old man's hands cradled the air as if holding those fragile bones, his expression one of awe and terrible reverence. His gestures grew frantic, passionate, as he acted out the god's flight from the enraged lords of the underworld, the bones shattering, and their eventual sprinkling with the god's own blood to give life to a new, flawed but living race of humans. The performance was not a telling but a possession, the old man a vessel for the gods in the darkness and the glorious, painful light of creation itself, leaving his audience breathless, their own hearts beating in time with the distant, sacred drums. The profound silence that followed the storyteller's final, whispered word lingered for a moment, a sacred pause before the market's mundane energy rushed back in to fill the void. Xochitl, her mind still swimming with images of dark underworlds and feathered serpents, felt pulled by a new, more earthly wonder. A splash of impossible color, more intense and concentrated than even the featherworker's stall, drew her gaze to a quiet corner where the air hummed with a different kind of magic. Here the alchemy was not of story or spirit but of pure, unadulterated pigment. Under a canopy of plain, undyed cotton, a family of dyers presided over their own stunning spectrum. They were surrounded by an array of large, burnished clay pots, each one a cauldron of captured light and essence. Xochitl approached slowly, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer vibrancy. The first pot held a blue so deep and profound it seemed to have been ladled from the midnight sky at its most absolute. It was indigo, a color of such richness, it appeared almost black in the shadow of the pot. But when a dyer lifted a soaked length of cotton from its depths, the fabric dripped a liquid sapphire that caught the sun and blazed with a cool celestial fire. Beside it simmered a pot of a shocking, vibrant crimson, a red that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. This was the treasure of the cochineal, a color painstakingly harvested from the crushed bodies of tiny insects that lived on the nopal cactus. The dyer, a woman with fingers permanently stained a bloody rose, stirred the pot with a long wooden paddle. And the scent that rose was faintly metallic, like hot stone and iron, a testament to the immense power held within such a small source. It was the color of nobility, of sacrifice, of the lifeblood that sustained the world. And Xochitl understood why mantles dyed with this hue were worth a fortune in cacao beans. But it was the third pot that held a different, sweeter magic. It glowed with the brilliant, cheerful yellow of 1,000 captured suns. This was the gift of the sunflower and marigold, petals harvested and boiled down to their essential brightness. The aroma here was not metallic or mineral, but floral and earthy, a warm, golden scent that spoke of open fields and long, sunny days. A dyer lifted a skein of undyed white cotton from this pot, and it emerged transformed, dripping liquid sunlight, its threads now the color of joy and vitality. Xochitl stood mesmerized before this triad of pots, the profound blue of the night, the vital red of life, and the joyful yellow of the sun. She saw, in that moment, that the weaver's magnificent stories were born here, in these humble pots of simmering color, where the raw elements of the earth were transformed into the very language of beauty itself. The vibrant, sun-drenched world of the dye sellers, with its pots of simmering rainbows, seemed to dim as a familiar dry. Herbal scent found its way back to Xochitl. It was the smell of the healer's stall of rue and dust and old secrets. She turned to find the curandero from earlier standing at the edge of his domain, but his attention was not on his wares of bones and obsidian. His gaze was turned upward, his milky eyes fixed on the vast, empty bowl of the sky. His body was utterly still, his head tilted in a posture of deep, unsettling concentration. Xochitl followed his gaze. The sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue all day, was beginning to change at its western edge. High, wispy clouds, like the breath of some distant giant, were smearing across the zenith, their undersides tinged with a faint, ominous yellow-gray. They were not the fluffy, benign clouds of morning, but something thinner, more agitated, moving with a purpose that felt out of sync with the gentle breeze that stirred the market-s awnings. But the curandero's lips were moving silently, as if in conversation with the shifting air itself. Then his eyes, ancient and knowing, dropped from the heavens and found Xochitl. They did not smile. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that was both a summons and a warning. His fingers, stained with the powders of his trade, pointed first to the high, yellowing clouds, then made a swift, slashing motion across the sky. He then pointed to the thatched roofs of the stalls and mimed the act of a heavy downpour, his hands falling in a relentless pounding rhythm. His message was clear, but he was not finished. His attention shifted to the upper beams of a nearby stall, where a group of swallows had been chattering incessantly all afternoon. Now they were silent. They sat in a tight, anxious row, their bodies pressed together, their heads darting in unison, not for insects, but toward the gathering haze in the west. Their usual, cheerful twitter was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful stillness. The healer pointed to them, then tapped his own temple, his expression grave. The birds knew. Their silence was a louder warning than any shout. Looked back at Xochitl, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He made one final gesture, bringing his hands together over his head as if forming a shelter, then pointed firmly to the ground at his feet. The meaning was unmistakable, a silent, urgent command woven from cloud patterns and bird silence. A storm was coming. Not a gentle rain to wash the dust away, but something fiercer. A thing of wind and driving water, but it was coming soon. He held her gaze for a moment longer, ensuring the warning was received before turning back to his stall and beginning to swiftly, methodically gather his most precious and vulnerable items, his movements now charged with a new grim purpose. The vibrant market, moments ago a place of color and barter, suddenly felt fragile, its bustling life poised on the edge of a coming deluge. The medicine woman's silent warning lingered in the air, a chilling prophecy that seemed to suck the warmth from the sun. For a few heartbeats, the market continued its oblivious rhythm, a symphony of commerce untouched by the threat gathering at the edge of the world. Then, a change, subtle but profound. The light shifted, the harsh brilliance of the afternoon sun softening into a strange, muted gold as the high, yellow-gray clouds began to veil its face. The air, once thick with heat and scent, grew still and heavy, pregnant with a waiting silence. The distant hum of the crowd seemed to dampen, as if 10,000 people had subconsciously drawn in a collective breath. The first drop was a surprise. Single, fat, cold splat on the back of Xochitl's hand where it rested on the woven mat. She flinched, looking down at the perfect circle of dark wetness beaded on her skin. It was followed by another, landing on the dry earth between stacks of tortillas, leaving a dark, star-shaped stain. Then a third, striking the clay pot of beans with a soft, definitive plink. There was a moment of suspended disbelief, a fragile hope that it was just a passing sprinkle. That hope shattered with the fourth drop, and the fifth, and then a sudden rushing patter that became a steady, insistent drumming on the countless cotton awnings overhead. The sound was a swift, rising roar, swallowing the market's noise. A collective gasp rippled through the plaza, followed by a single unified moment of stunned paralysis. Then, chaos erupted. The market, a model of ordered frenzy just seconds before, dissolved into a frantic, scrambling organism. The cry went up, not from one voice, but from thousands, a wordless surge of alarm and urgency. Merchants became a blur of motion, their priorities instantly narrowed to one imperative: protect the goods. Xochitl watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the world descended into a desperate ballet of preservation. The feather worker, her face a mask of panic, swept armfuls of priceless quetzal plumes into a large covered basket. Her movements frantic as the vibrant greens and scarlets began to darken with moisture. The potter bellowed for his sons, who scrambled to grab the intricately painted bowls and stack them into large, lidded storage jars, their precious designs vulnerable to the dissolving rain. The dye sellers scrambled to drag their pots of simmering pigment under the scant shelter of their awning, the vibrant liquids sloshing dangerously. The goldsmith, with a terrifying calm, swept his dazzling wares into a locked chest. His movements swift and precise, each piece of fortune saved from the deluge. The food vendors fought a losing battle, the steam from their tamale pots now mingling with the rain, the camals hissing in protest as water hit their hot surfaces.
Ouch.
Everywhere the colorful canopies of the stalls, once symbols of commerce, became the focus of a frantic tug-of-war as vendors and their families pulled on ropes to tighten them. Against the wind that was now whipping through the plaza, driving the rain in stinging horizontal sheets, the first drops had become a downpour, and the great market of Tlatelolco was drowning in a cold, furious chaos. The cold fury of the downpour erased all thought, all hesitation. Xochitl's mother moved with a speed born of instinct and long practice. Her hands a blur, she snatched the precious basket of cacao beans and the small copper bell, tucking them deep into the folds of her clothing. Xochitl needed no instruction. She seized the heavy clay pot of beans, its warmth a fleeting comfort against the sudden chill, and hugged it tight to her chest. There was no time to properly cover their tortillas. The stacks of golden maize, their morning's labor, were left exposed on the soaking mats, dissolving into a sad, pulpy mass as the rain hammered down. A sharp tug on her arm pulled Xochitl from the sight of their ruined goods. Her mother's eyes, wide with a shared urgency, scanned the chaotic plaza. The nearest substantial shelter was the wide, sturdy awning of the salt traders, its faded canvas billowing violently, but holding firm against the onslaught. They were not the only ones with the idea. A tide of drenched, desperate people surged toward the same patch of promised dryness, a frantic river of humanity seeking any port in the storm. They plunged into the press of bodies, the rain lashing their faces and soaking their thin cotton clothes until they were heavy and cold. The world narrowed to the slapping of wet sandals on mud, the gasping breaths of the crowd, and the relentless roar of the rain. They squeezed under the awning's edge, joining a huddle of shivering vendors and customers, all pressed together for meager protection. The air under the canopy was thick with the smell of wet cotton, damp earth, and the sharp, clean scent of rain. Pressing close to her mother's side, Xochitl looked out from their cramped shelter. The transformation was absolute and terrifying. The vibrant, dust-choked plaza was being erased before her eyes. The hard-packed earth, trodden by a million feet, was turning into a churning, brown river. Rivulets of muddy water carved new pathways through the market, swirling around the bases of stalls and carrying away forgotten bits of produce. A single feather, a child's lost sandal. The brilliant colors of the awnings had turned dark and sodden, their hues muted into shades of gray and brown. The mighty market of Tlatelolco, the pulsing heart of an empire, was brought to its knees. Its grandeur reduced to a struggle for a few handspans of dry ground. As the relentless rain transformed its very dust into mud, the fury did not last. As swiftly as it had descended, the storm's anger spent itself. The pounding roar on the awning softened to a gentle patter, then to the isolated plink of residual drops falling from the soaked canvas edges, and then into a profound, dripping silence. The wind, which had whipped the rain into stinging sheets, stilled completely, leaving the air motionless and strangely new. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the huddled masses under the salt trader's awning, a release of held breath and pent-up fear. Xochitl was among the first to venture out from the shelter, her small feet sinking into the soft, saturated earth. The world she stepped into was utterly transformed, washed clean of its dust and grime and the accumulated heat of the day. The air itself was the first marvel, was cool and carried a pristine mineral scent, the smell of wet stone and cleansed earth, of soaked thatch and rinsed cotton. It was a fragrance so pure and sharp it felt like the first air after creation, filling the lungs with a shocking, invigorating freshness. All around her, the market was slowly, tentatively coming back to life. People emerged from their shelters, blinking in the strange, diffused light. The storm clouds were scudding away to the east, and in their wake, the late afternoon sun broke through. Not with its earlier oppressive glare, but with a soft golden warmth that set the entire wet world gleaming. And from every sun-touched surface, steam began to rise. It curled from the dark, wet stones of the walkways, from the soaked wooden posts of the stalls, and from the countless puddles that now mirrored the clearing sky. The plaza became a place of gentle, ethereal mist, the steam weaving through the azes like silent, wandering ghosts. It rose from the hot camals of the food vendors, who were already cautiously rekindling their fires, and from the damp clothing of the crowd, creating a low-hanging haze that smelled of rain and smoke and renewal. The frantic chaos of minutes before was gone, replaced by a quiet, collective effort of assessment and recovery. The vibrant heart of Tlatelolco, rinsed and cooled, was beating once more, its pulse measured and steady in the calm after-rain stillness. The sun, now a softened, bruised orange sinking toward the western mountains, cast long, distorted shadows across the transformed plaza. The steam that had risen like a ghostly exhalation from the rain-drenched stones was thinning, dissipating into the cool evening air. The frantic energy of the storm's aftermath had settled into a weary, purposeful rhythm, the rhythm of ending. All around them, the great market of Tlatelolco was folding in upon itself, a magnificent beast retreating into slumber after the day's long, vibrant roar. The call to pack up was silent but universal, communicated in the shared, tired glances between vendors. In the resigned sighs that accompanied the assessment of water-damaged goods, Xochitl watched as the featherworker, her face still etched with the panic of the downpour, carefully tucked her last, slightly bedraggled quetzal plume into a lined wooden chest, closing the lid with a soft, final click. The dye sellers were pouring the precious rainwater-diluted contents of their pots into smaller sealed jars, their movements economical and grim. The air, once thick with 100 competing aromas, was now dominated by the clean, sad scent of wet wool and the melancholy smell of unsold food beginning to turn. Xochitl turned to their own small domain. The woven palm fiber mats were soaked through, dark and heavy with water. Their surface, which had held such neat, hopeful stacks just hours before, was now a trampled, muddy mess. The few tortillas that had not dissolved into pulp were unsalvageable, speckled with dirt and weighed down by moisture. There was no saving them. With a quiet sigh that mirrored her mother's, she bent to the task. She helped her mother gather the corners of one sodden mat, their hands working in unison. They lifted it, water streaming from its edges, and folded it over once. Then again, the action a silent funeral for the day's lost labor. The weight of it was a physical manifestation of their disappointment. They did the same with the second mat, creating a heavy, damp bundle that contained the remnants of their hopes. There was no chatter, no recounting of the day's wonders or disputes. The evening preparation was a somber, tactile poem of resignation, a silent acknowledgement of what was lost to the rain and what little was saved. They worked quickly, their movements a well-rehearsed dance of dissolution, packing away not just their goods, but the day itself, folding it into memory as the light faded from the sky. The bundled, sodden mats lay beside them, a heavy, waterlogged testament to the storm's caprice. The vibrant market was now a landscape of damp resignation, vendors packing away their remaining salvageable wares with tired, methodical movements. The air, though fresh and clean, carried the melancholy scent of diminished hopes and rain-soaked goods. Xochitl and her mother had just finished securing their few saved treasures, the small basket of cacao beans and the copper bell, when a figure emerged from the thinning crowd. His approach slow and burdened. He was a farmer, his shoulders stooped, not just with the weight of his years, but with the exhaustion of a long day and a difficult season. The skin of his face was a map of sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of endless labor under an unforgiving sky. His simple cotton clothes were patched and faded, damp from the recent rain, and spattered with the rich, dark mud of the chinampas. In his hands, he held a small woven pouch, its contents meager but precious. His eyes, tired yet kind, scanned the few stalls still open, lingering on their own humble setup, on the now empty space where the tortillas had been. He approached them with a hesitant dignity, his steps careful on the slick ground. He did not speak, but his eyes held a question, a silent plea that needed no words. He opened the pouch, revealing its contents. A final handful of common beans, the same kind that had simmered in their own pot. They were not the dark, valuable cacao, but the pale, humble beans that were the bedrock of sustenance, the food of the people. He gestured toward the ruined, pulpy mass that had been their tortillas, then to his own pouch, his expression one of apology for the modesty of his offer. Tlatelolco's mother looked from the farmer's weary, hopeful face to the few unsalvageable tortillas that remained. There was no value left in them, no trade to be made. Yet she nodded, her own face softening with a deep understanding that transcended commerce. This was not a transaction of value, but one of shared struggle. She gathered the wet, broken pieces, perhaps 6 or 7 tortillas in all, placed them gently into the farmer's outstretched hands. His fingers closed around the offering, and a warmth seemed to flood his weathered features, smoothing the lines of exhaustion for a brief moment. He looked from the food to Xochitl, then to her mother, his gratitude shining in his eyes brighter than any polished gem in the market. He brought his hands together in a gesture of thanks, a small, solemn bow of his head conveying a depth of appreciation that filled the space between them. He tucked the tortillas carefully into his tunic, close to his heart, as if they were a great treasure. With one last warm look that seemed to bless their entire family, he turned and melted away into the gray twilight, his step a little lighter, his burden shared. It was the final sale of the day, a trade that measured wealth not in cacao or copper, but in the quiet, profound currency of human kindness. The farmer's grateful figure disappeared into the twilight, leaving behind a quiet that felt deeper than the market's usual evening calm. With the last act of the day, as commerce complete a transaction of compassion rather than currency, Xochitl and her mother turned their attention inward, to the true measure of their labor. They found a dry patch of stone near the edge of the plaza, the last of the day's warmth still radiating from its surface, and sat together, their damp clothes clinging uncomfortably, but their spirits lifting with the promise of assessment. From the secure folds of her mother's tunic came the small woven basket. Xochitl's heart gave a little leap of anticipation as her mother set it carefully between them. This was the moment that gave shape and meaning to the long hours, the weary feet, the scorching sun, and even the punishing rain. Her mother's capable hands, though red and tired, moved with a ceremonial slowness as she appended the basket onto the flat stone. A small, precious cascade of their earnings tumbled out, gleaming in the soft, fading light. The cacao beans formed the heart of the pile, dark and wrinkled like tiny, fertile stones. Xochitl immediately began to separate them, her small fingers pushing them into neat rows of 5, her lips moving in a silent count. Each bean was a victory, a handful of maize secured, a thread in the fabric of their survival. The number was good, better than some days, a solid foundation that brought a quiet smile to her mother's face. Then came the more extraordinary treasures, the day's unexpected blessings. A few precious feathers, slightly damp but still stunning, lay amidst the beans. There were 2 long, iridescent green feathers from a cotinga, a gift from the feather worker in a moment of shared sympathy after the storm. Their color, the deep green of a forest pool, and there was a single, perfect scarlet macaw plume, its tip still brilliantly sharp, a treasure found nestled near their stall after the crowd had scattered. It's a small gift from the capricious gods of the market. But the crown jewel, the object that made Xochitl's breath catch, was the small copper bell. It lay half buried in the beans, its surface darkened with age, but still catching the last of the sun's rays with a soft, warm glow. It had been traded by a traveling metalsmith from the west for a double portion of beans during the lull before the storm. Its faint, dull chime, a sound of rare beauty. It was not food, not a practical thing, but it was wealth. It was a thing of beauty and potential, a treasure that could be traded again in a lean season for a great deal of maize or beans. Xochitl's mother gathered the feathers and placed them gently to one side, then picked up the copper bell, holding it in her palm as if weighing its worth and its wonder. She looked at the tidy rows of cacao beans, the vibrant feathers, and the bell, then at her daughter's proud, smudged face. A deep, satisfied sigh escaped her, one that held the day's fatigue, but also its quiet triumph. They had faced the market's grandeur and its chaos, its abundance and its sudden violence, and they had emerged with their basket not empty. They had enough. It was not a fortune, but it was sufficient. It was a good day. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the departing echoes of Tlatelolco, they sat together in a pool of shared contentment. The tangible fruits of their labor spread before them like a silent, perfect poem. The quiet satisfaction of their counted earnings, the warm weight of the copper bell and the tidy rows of cacao beans, was slowly eclipsed by a new presence in the darkening sky. It began as a thin, dark thread against the soft oranges and purples of the sunset, a stark and solemn contrast to the day's fading beauty. From the great temple precinct, the sacred heart of the city that had beat with drums all afternoon, a column of smoke began to rise. It was not the clean, white smoke of a cooking fire or the thin, blue haze of incense. This smoke was different. It was thick and dark, a deep, oily black that seemed to swallow the twilight rather than reflect it, climbing steadily into the still air in a straight, purposeful line. A palpable change moved through the few vendors and families still lingering in the plaza. The gentle murmur of evening conversations died away. The weary, satisfied energy of packing up dissolved into a shared, somber stillness. All movement seemed to cease as eyes old and young were drawn upward to that dark, rising pillar. It was a sight as familiar as the sunrise, yet it never failed to cast a profound silence over the city. This was the smoke of the sacred braziers, the smoke of concluded ceremony. And everyone knew what fuel fed such a dense and enduring fire. A collective memory seemed to fall over the marketplace, a memory of the drums that had pulsed through the day, a rhythm that had spoken of something far older and more demanding than trade. The vibrant colors of the feathers, the gleam of the gold, the rich taste of the chocolate olivet suddenly felt small and fleeting under the shadow of that smoke. It was a reminder that the market's abundance, its very life, existed within a larger, more severe economy. The goods, the wealth, the full stomachs, they were gifts that required repayment. A balance maintained not with cacao beans or cotton mantles, but with a far more precious currency. Xochitl felt the shift deep in her bones. The playful image of the toy maker's jaguar, the brilliant hues of the dyes, the storyteller's thrilling tale-all were gently pushed aside by a heavier, more ancient understanding. She looked at the faces around her, seeing not fatigue or satisfaction, but a quiet, resigned reverence. The dark smoke was a silent answer to the drums, a confirmation of duties fulfilled in the world above the market. It spoke of sacrifices offered, of blood given to nourish the gods, so that the sun would continue its journey. The rains would fall upon the fields, and the world would not slip back into the silent darkness of Mictlan. It was the city's true exhalation, a breath of solemnity and permanence that settled over the wet, steaming stones of Tlatelolco, humbling the day's human endeavors and binding them once more to the timeless, demanding will of the gods. The dark temple smoke lingered in the still air, a solemn veil drawn across the memory of the day's vibrant chaos. Its silent message seemed to signal a universal release, a permission for the market's weary participants to finally disengage from the great plaza's beating heart. All around Xochitl and her mother, the last of the vendors shouldered their remaining bundles. Their movements slow and heavy, with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle and bone. It was the weariness of a day fully lived, of senses overwhelmed and energy spent. They joined the slow-flowing current of people moving away from the center of Tlatelolco, a river of humanity now flowing in reverse, carrying its participants back to the quiet edges of the city, to homes and hearths, and the simple comforts of the familiar. The basket on Xochitl's back felt different, now lighter in physical weight, yet infinitely heavier with the day's accumulated memories. It held not the hopeful stacks of tortillas from the morning, but the sodden, folded mats and the precious, small basket of their earnings, a compact summary of their endeavor. With each step away from the great plaza, the world's soundscape began to transform. The roaring, all-encompassing cacophony that had been a constant presence, the din of 10,000 voices, the calls of vendors, the bleating of animals. The rhythmic work of artisans began to recede, softening first to a loud hum, then to a murmur, and finally to a collection of isolated, fading sounds. The sharp cry of a late-selling food vendor, the distant clatter of a potter packing his last bowl, the laughter of children chasing each other through the puddles. Each sound seemed to stretch and thin, becoming a ghost of itself as the distance grew. They walked in a comfortable, shared silence. Mother and daughter, their strides matching in a weary rhythm. The cooling air was a balm after the heat and the rain, carrying now the clean, damp scent of the city itself, wet stone, steamed clay, and the distant green smell of the Chinampa gardens. The brilliant, overwhelming tapestry of the market was at their backs now, its colors and energies folding in upon itself, receding into the gathering twilight like a magnificent dream upon waking. They were leaving the empire's pulsing heart, carrying its echoes within them, walking away from the roar and into the growing quiet of the evening, weary in body, but deeply quietly, content in spirit. Zaquito's fingers closed around the small copper bell tucked safely in the fold of her sash. Its cool, solid presence a grounding point in the twilight's gentle dissolution of the world. Each step away from the market's fading hum was a step deeper into a softer, more intimate reality. The hard-packed earth of the causeway, still damp from the storm, gave softly under her sandals, releasing the rich, petrichor scent of rain-soaked soil, a fragrance that felt ancient and cleansing. Fireflies began to animate the deepening shadows along the canal banks, their intermittent pulses of cold light mirroring the first stars pricking the violet expanse above. She tightened her grip on the bell, feeling the precise craftsmanship of its shape. The slight ridge where the two halves of the mold had met. It was not just an object, it was a vessel. It held the metallic taste of the Western smith's workshop, the echo of his appraising glance, the weight of the extra beans her mother had traded without hesitation, recognizing its value. It held the sharp electric tension of the approaching storm, the frantic moments of securing it away from the rain. And now, it held the quiet triumph of the walk home, a tangible piece of the market's magic that was hers to keep. Its potential silent chimes seemed to contain the entire day's symphony, the vendor chants, the storyteller's rhythms, the downpour's roar, and the evening's peaceful exhalation. Clutching this treasure from the swirling heart of Tlatelolco, Xochitl walked on, the bell a tiny, solid heart beating in time with her own, a perfect, quiet secret in the soft indigo night. The familiar silhouette of their small, thatch-roofed home emerged from the twilight, a dark shape against the deep indigo of the evening sky. Its outline a promise of warmth and rest after the long, exhilarating exhaustion of the day. A thin, pale ribbon of smoke curled from the opening in the roof, carrying the humble, heartening scent of their own hearth fire, a smell that meant safety and belonging. As they drew closer, the low, familiar sound of young voices reached them. And then two small figures detached themselves from the shadows of the doorway and came running, their bare feet whispering against the damp earth. Zaquitl's younger siblings, a boy and a girl. Their faces alight with the eager anticipation that only the return of family can bring, skidded to a halt before them. Their eyes, wide and dark in the fading light, scanned their mother and sister, taking in the damp clothing, the tired postures, but most of all, the basket that held the day's story. They did not clamor for treats or treasures. Their presence was a welcome in itself, a silent, joyful anchor pulling them the final steps across the threshold. Inside, the single room was bathed in the soft orange glow of the fire pit, its light dancing on the walls of packed earth and thatch. The air was warm and close, filled with the simple, essential aroma of beans that had been simmering for hours, a scent woven through with the faint, sweet smoke of the cooking fire. Their grandmother looked up from where she knelt by the hearth, her old face creasing into a smile of relief and welcome, her hands pausing in their task of patting out the last of the morning's masa into a few final precious tortillas. The basket was set down with a soft thud, its weight finally relinquished. There was no grand presentation, no fanfare. The day's earnings were for tomorrow's concerns. Tonight was for homecoming. The simple meal was laid out on a clean mat, a bowl of the rich. Dark beans from the pot, their surface shimmering with a slick of precious fat, and the small stack of warm, freshly cooked tortillas, their edges slightly blackened from the camal. It was a humble feast, a stark contrast to the market's dazzling array. Yet it possessed a depth of flavor and a sense of wholeness that no spiced chocolate or roasted turkey could ever match. They ate in a comfortable, weary silence, broken only by the soft sounds of consumption and the crackle of the fire. Each bite was a return, a reaffirmation of their place in the world. A silent gratitude for the roof overhead, the food in their bellies, and the familiar, loving faces gathered in the firelight. The immense pulsing heart of Tlatelolco, with all its wonders and terrors, was now a memory. Here, in the quiet dimness of their home, they were whole. Exhaustion was a heavy blanket, pulling Xochitl down into the woven palm fibers of her sleeping mat. The day's final images, the fire's dying embers, her grandmother's serene profile, the comforting weight of a full stomach dissolved into the warm, dark quiet of the room. But as her body surrendered to sleep, her mind did not find rest. Instead, it leaped awake, untethered from the weary flesh, and began to weave the day's vibrant threads into a tapestry of dreams. The darkness behind her eyelids bloomed with color. It was not the muted pallor of the twilight journey home, but the shocking, saturated brilliance of the market at its zenith. She dreamed of the cochineal red of the dyes, a red so deep it felt like a physical pressure. Against her dreaming eyes in the celestial indigo, that was not a color, but a feeling of falling into a cool, bottomless sky. The quetzal feathers were not mere plumes, but rivers of living emerald, flowing and twisting around her in a silent, graceful dance. The gold of the smith's jewelry was not metal, but captured sunlight, molten and warm, pooling in her hands without burning. The dream had a soundtrack, a symphony assembled from the day's cacophony. The rhythmic crunch of the metate from the morning transformed into the steady, pounding beat of the temple drums, a deep, solemn heartthrob that underpinned everything. Over it, the chocolate seller's melodic chant wove itself around the guttural, clicking speech of the distant traveler, creating a strange, beautiful music. The sudden, shocking roar of the rainstorm crashed through this melody, only to be soothed by the soft, sibilant whisper of the storyteller's tale, his voice the wind itself. And then came the smells, the most potent memory of all. They assailed her dreaming self, not as faint recollections, but as overpowering realities. The rich, complex aroma of frothy chocolate steamed in the air beside her. The sharp, eye-watering perfume of roasting chilies made her dream self cough. The clean, mineral scent of the salt blocks filled her nose, and the dry, ancient fragrance of the healer's herbs was a dusty cloud she walked through. She could smell the wet earth after the rain, the scent of renewal so potent it was almost a taste. And weaving through it all, the warm, simple, comforting smell of their own tortillas on the comal, a humble, golden thread in the magnificent, overwhelming tapestry. She did not dream of events in order, but as a swirling, sensory vortex. One moment, she was watching the feather worker's hands conjure an eagle from nothing but light and air. The next, she was counting cacao beans that gleamed like obsidian. Then she was standing frozen before the hollow eyes of the collared slaves, only to be pulled into the joyful, silent flight of the toy-maker's clay jaguar. The market was no longer a place outside of her. It was a world within her, its vibrant, pulsing heart beating in time with her own. It was chaos and order, beauty and terror, overwhelming grandeur and humble dignity, all swirling together in a magnificent, endless dance. She slept deeply, a small smile touching her lips, her spirit wandering the boundless, remembered plazas of Tlatelolco, forever alive in the theater of her dreams.